Episode 1. The Opium Inferno. London, 1887. Midnight. The city wheezed beneath a thick yellow fog, somewhere between smoke and disease. Gaslights flickered like dying stars, casting long, twitching shadows over the slick cobblestones. The Thames oozed black as a grave digger's lung. Somewhere in the distance, a woman screamed. No one paid any mind. Dr. John Watson pulled his coat tighter, stepping out of the cab and onto Baker Street. The night was cold, but his nerves were colder. This is it then, the great Sherlock Holmes. A mind like a razor, they said. A genius, they whispered. A man who could read your soul like yesterday's newspaper. Watson knocked. The door swung open immediately. Holmes stood before him, shirtless, barefoot, a dressing gown barely clinging to his narrow frame. His hair was a magnificent disaster, a symphony of disorder. One sleeve of his robe hung loose, revealing the barest trace of a needle mark near his elbow. His eyes, God help him, his eyes burned like the last embers of a funeral pyre. "Ah, Watson," Holmes exclaimed, as if greeting an old friend he had just met. "Just in time. Quick, tell me, what do you make of this?" Before Watson could protest, Holmes threw a dead cat into his arms. Watson recoiled. The cat, a wiry, matted thing, was cold as stone. Rigor mortis had set in, yet the eyes were wide with terror. "Dear God, man! Yes, pleasantries later!" Holmes snatched the cat back, turning it over like a particularly interesting book. You see, this feline was not killed by natural means. Note the constricted pupils, the tautness of the jaw. He was poisoned, Watson. Watson had precisely two responses in mind. 1. Leave immediately. 2. Shoot Holmes and claim self-defense. Instead, he took a slow breath. By whom? A better question is why. Holmes grinned. A wolfish thing, sharp and unnerving. A lost cat is merely lost. A murdered cat, however, that, my dear doctor, is a message. And I do so love a well-penned letter. Before Watson could protest, a second knock rattled the door. Enter Inspector Lestrade, a man whose entire career was defined by the fact that he wasn't quite smart enough to quit. His coat was still damp from the filth of the city, and the scent of cheap gin trailed him like a loyal hound. "Holmes, we have a case, a big one. You'll want to put on trousers." Holmes sighed dramatically. "Must I?" 2 opium dens burned to the ground. Dozens dead. Third one just went up near Limehouse. At this, Holmes froze. The smirk faded, just slightly, replaced by something colder. Calculating. Arson. Arson, yes. But it's not just the fires. It's the pattern. The victims. Whoever's doing this, they're selective. It's like they know exactly who they want to burn. Holmes' fingers twitched. The game had begun. He whirled to Watson. "We'll need a cab, a flask of brandy, and at least one firearm. I assume you carry?" "Of course," Watson said dryly. "I'm not an idiot." "Splendid. Then let's away. Lestrade, do try to keep up." And with that, Sherlock Holmes swept from the room, barefoot, brilliant, and half-mad, with Watson, armed and already regretting his life choices, right behind him. The underbelly of London reeked of sweat, laudanum, and desperation. Fog curled through the narrow alleys, thick with the scent of unwashed bodies and the acrid tang of burning opium. Here, in Limehouse, the city breathed in smoke and exhaled ruin. Holmes strode through the filth with the confidence of a man walking through his own drawing room. Watson followed, one hand resting on his revolver, the other itching to pull Holmes back from whatever madness currently possessed him. "Opium, Watson," Holmes mused, dodging a beggar with the grace of a dancer. "A substance of exquisite contradiction. It soothes, yet enslaves. It inspires, yet devours. A physician's blessing turned the devil's noose." "And our arsonist?" Watson prompted, stepping over a slumped figure whose arm was a battlefield of puncture wounds. "A poet with a matchbook," Holmes replied. "A man who once healed, now obsessed with purification through destruction. He does not merely burn, Watson. He purges." Lestrade, trailing just behind, cleared his throat. "We've identified him. Name's Dr. Elias Mercer. Used to be a respected physician. Had a practice in Mayfair. Then he fell into the very addiction he treated. Lost everything. Wife, home, reputation. Disappeared for years. Now he's back, and he's turned arsonist. Holmes nodded, eyes gleaming. Yes, of course. The phoenix does not rise from ashes, it creates them. This isn't revenge, Watson, it's rebirth. And I do so love a zealot. They make such fascinating conversationalists. Watson grimaced. Or corpses. Holmes ignored him, stopping before the blackened skeleton of the most recent inferno. The remains of an opium den still smoldering, its charred beams stretching toward the heavens like pleading hands. He crouched, brushing his fingers through the soot, then lifted them to his nose. Kerosene, he murmured. But something else, a compound, clever. Our phoenix is a chemist as well as a physician. He's ensuring that the fires burn hot. No mere accident. He wants these places utterly consumed. Lestrade frowned. How do we catch him? We don't know his next target. Holmes straightened, dusting his hands off on Watson's coat. We don't need to find him, Lestrade. We simply need to make ourselves irresistibly flammable. Watson sighed. I assume that means something appallingly dangerous. Holmes grinned. Oh, unquestionably. The trap was set. Holmes and Watson, posing as clientele, entered one of the few remaining opium dens in Limehouse. The air inside was thick with sweet smoke, curling in ghostly tendrils from brass pipes. The patrons lay sprawled on cushions, half conscious, adrift on the tides of oblivion. Watson shifted uncomfortably. Are you certain this will work? Holmes, reclining against a low table, took a delicate sniff of the air. Oh, he'll come. This place is one of the last unburned dens in the city. If Mercer truly believes in his crusade, he must set it alight. The question, dear Watson, is whether he'll wait for us to leave first. The answer came sooner than expected. A flicker of movement in the doorway. A figure in a long coat, face obscured by shadow. Holmes tensed. Showtime. Then, before Watson could draw his revolver, the world erupted in flame. A deafening roar swallowed the room as fire streaked along the walls, racing in hungry fingers across the wooden beams. Smoke billowed, thick and choking, as chaos consumed the den. Patrons screamed, stumbling over one another in a desperate bid for escape. Holmes and Watson barely had time to register what had happened before the ceiling groaned ominously overhead. Watson grabbed Holmes by the collar. You and your irresistibly flammable ideas. Holmes, grinning wildly despite the inferno closing in around them, coughed out a laugh. Yes, quite. Now let's not die, shall we? The warehouse blazed, a cauldron of smoke and fire that seemed to consume all in its path. The flames flickered like the tongues of demons, casting an eerie glow across the charred remnants of shelves and crates. There, amidst the roaring inferno, stood the Phoenix, his figure outlined by the infernal glow, his eyes cold and unyielding as he turned to face Sherlock Holmes. Do you see it, Holmes? The Phoenix's voice rang through the tumult, sharp and mocking, the world burning around us, just as it was always meant to. You're so sure of your intellect, your control over this world, yet here you stand, helpless, as it crumbles before your very eyes. Holmes, barely able to hear above the crackle of the flames, took a slow, deliberate step forward. His eyes narrowed as the air thickened with smoke, but his gaze never left the figure of the Phoenix. You, Holmes began, his voice a low rasp, barely audible. You're no different than the fire itself, chaotic, consuming, destructive. What is it you want, Phoenix, to watch the world burn? The Phoenix smirked, stepping into the inferno, seemingly untouched by the flames that licked at his coat. What I want, Holmes, is for you to see it. See yourself in the flames. The end of everything you've worked for, everything you've built. The fire, it is not outside you, it is within you. It always has been. Holmes staggered, feeling the edges of his vision blur. His breath came shallow and erratic, as the combination of smoke and laudanum distorted his perception. The warehouse walls shifted and warped, twisting into grotesque shapes. The Phoenix's form flickered, his outline stretching and twisting like a fiery spectre, an apparition that mirrored the destruction Holmes had always feared. His hands trembled as he reached out, desperate to grasp the fleeting reality. Is this it? Holmes thought, the world spinning out of focus. Am I the flame? The phoenix's laughter echoed, a hollow, cruel sound. What a beautiful thing it is, isn't it? The world, reduced to ash, and yet you remain trapped in your own delusions. You thought you could control the fire, Holmes, but the truth is, you've always been its fuel. The smoke thickened, blurring Holmes' vision, and he stumbled back, desperate to escape the suffocating haze. His mind was a tangle of confusion, and yet there was clarity in his final decision. With a sigh, Holmes turned his back on the phoenix. I will not chase you any longer. You are but a shadow of my own making. Watson, standing at the threshold of the burning building, watched in horror. Holmes, what are you doing? He cried, his voice barely audible over the fire's roar. You can't just let him go. Holmes paused, his silhouette a mere shadow in the infernal glow. He turned slowly, his face unreadable. The world will end in fire, Watson, he murmured, his voice distant, hollow. Who am I to deny it? As the smoke continued to churn and the flames consumed the warehouse, Holmes and Watson watched in silence. The phoenix, once a force of chaos, disappeared into the inferno, leaving only the flickering remnants of his presence. The two men turned in quiet resignation, their footsteps heavy as they exited the inferno. But just as they reached the door, a soft sound broke through the smoke. Someone, somewhere, had slipped something through the crack in the door. Holmes bent down and retrieved the letter, its seal unbroken. His gaze hardened as he read its contents, his mind already shifting into the mode of a detective once more. Watson, ever the loyal companion, watched him with growing concern. A new villain, Holmes muttered, his voice cold and unwavering. A blackmailer preying on the secrets of London's elite. Watson's heart sank as the weight of those words settled in. The game, Watson, Holmes said, a gleam of cold determination in his eyes. It is far from over.